Hi, welcome to Give Me the Bible, where God's Word speaks for itself. As we continue our discussion of the God of logic, I want to talk about how atheists really have no ultimate justification for logic. If you hold an atheistic worldview, you simply cannot account for the existence of the laws of logic. Just want to look at a couple verses to start in Ephesians chapter 4. And I realize this may sound insulting if you are an atheist. This is not meant to be an insult at all. It is simply the logical result of what happens when we deny God. When we live in God's world while also denying the God who created it, what we are left with is futility or emptiness in our thinking. So in Ephesians 4, verse 17, he says, "So this I say and affirm together with the Lord, that you walk no longer just as the Gentiles also walk in the futility of their mind, being darkened in their understanding." Look in Romans chapter 1. Romans chapter 1 says something similar. He says in verse 21, Romans 1, "Even though they knew God, they did not honor him as God or give thanks, but they became futile in their speculations, and their foolish heart was darkened. Professing to be wise, they became fools." What ends up happening is, in our society especially, it seems that denying God's existence makes you intellectually elite. That if you are really an intellectual person and a wise person in our culture, well, you will know that God doesn't exist and that this world is all there is. And what the Bible's trying to show us is actually when you deny God and you make that profession that, oh, I'm a wise person and I'm very intellectual and I have this deep understanding of how things really work, in reality, you go backwards in your intellect. You go backwards into your wisdom and you become foolish, and all of your thoughts really become empty speculation with no substance, no real ultimate justification at all. And that is certainly the case when we talk about how the atheistic worldview accounts for logic, because from an atheistic perspective, this physical existence is all that there is. All that there is stuff. Somebody once referred, kind of being silly, but he referred to atheism as stuffism, because all there is physical, stuff that I can see, that I can taste, that I can, sense with the senses of my body and my flesh. And not only that, but we have evolved as human beings over time through mindless, completely unguided by any intelligence at all, these mindless chemical reactions based on time and chance. And if that is the case, how is it that you can account for universal, immaterial, unchanging laws of logic? If all there is this material universe and stuff, well, what do you do with immaterial things like the laws of logic? You can't see logic. Logic is not stuff. It's something that seems to exist outside of this physical realm that we can observe and experience through our senses. So how do you justify that as an atheist? Well, a couple ways that atheists will attempt to justify it. One is just, well, hey, logic just exists. I mean, it's just here. There's no denying it. It just exists. It doesn't need an explanation. Well, that's not going to fly, because, if Christians tried that with God, if we said, well, God just exists and that's it, and there's no explanation needed, he just exists, well, that would never really work. We don't deny that logic exists. The question is, why does it exist? How can you, as an atheist, account for the existence of these laws? And really, the main answer that atheists give, that first one, that's kind of a softball. Most atheists don't just say, well, logic just exists. Most will say logic just comes from our minds. It's just a way that we conceptualize the world in our minds, kind of like, the number 7, right? It's not, number 7 isn't really like a thing that you can see or sense with your experience or experience with your senses, but it is just a way, it's just a concept in our minds. It's kind of a social construct over time to help us kind of navigate in the world. And there are a few problems with that. Number 1, you're making logic out, if we make logic out to be just the product of our minds, well, then that means logic and those laws would not have existed until human beings were around to conceptualize them. So Frank Turek, in one of his books, he asks atheists, before there were any human beings on the earth, was the statement, "there are no human beings on the earth," true? Was that statement logically true before there were any human beings around to conceptualize it? And the answer, of course, is yes. Yes, absolutely it is, because the laws of logic were in effect, right? Whether or not there were any humans around to conceptualize it. They seem to exist outside of just what we conceptualize in our minds. And another reason why that's the case is because, number 2, arguments would have no proof. If logic is just something that we've conceptualized in our own minds, that means there's no objective standard outside of my own mind to tell whether my thoughts are logical or not. And in fact, if I get in a debate with you and we're trying to discuss the logic of our arguments, there's no way that you and I could ever walk away with proof of our arguments, with who is being more logical. Because if I'm operating by my own logic that I've conceptualized in my mind, and you're operating by your own logic that you've conceptualized in your mind, then it can be perfectly logical to you, and my logic is perfectly logical to me. And we just walk away at a stalemate. What we experience in life, though, is that's not how it works. What we experience is when we have a debate, when we have a disagreement, and we're trying to figure out whose arguments are more logical, it's almost like we're appealing to some standard of logic outside of ourselves, outside of that debate, by which to determine whether your argument is more or less logical than my argument. We're not just arguing based on the concepts that we've come up with in our mind. And that leads to the third part. Communication would really be impossible if you were operating by your own laws of logic that you came up with in your own mind, and I was operating by the laws of logic that came up with in my own mind. Well, then communication would be impossible. It would be nonsensical. We wouldn't even be able to have a dialogue. There has to be this agreed upon standard of logical argumentation that we're going to use if we're going to even have an intelligible conversation. And finally, the fourth problem with that is, if logic is simply a concept that we've developed in our own minds, atheism really has no ultimate justification for trusting our minds. You see, if we just evolved from mindless, non-guided process, unguided by any sort of intelligent process whatsoever, these chemical reactions over time with no sense of purpose or direction or design, well then how do we know that our minds evolved properly or not? How do we know if the logic that we have evolved to understand and conceptualize is actually trustworthy? And the only way that you could try to prove that, an atheist might disagree and say, well, yeah, we can trust our minds. But the problem is, the only way to prove that you can trust your mind is by using your own mind to do so. The only way to prove that you have properly conceived of logic is to try to use the logic you've conceived of in order to prove it. And so what ends up happening is atheism becomes a self-defeating view that provides absolutely no justification for its beliefs about the origin of the laws of logic. And again, in presuppositional apologetics, it is this idea that if you're presupposing that God does not exist, it means that you have no ultimate justification for your worldviews in terms of how you view and justify things like logic, the ability to do science, and even morality itself. And Romans 1, Ephesians 4 become true, that all you're left with is empty speculation. Well, I'm not sure where the laws of logic came from. Well, maybe we just came up with it in our own minds. If I can't really prove it, I could try to use my own mind to prove it, but that doesn't really work. That's circular reasoning. And so at the end of the day, you're kind of left with nothing. Whereas if you have a theistic worldview, if you come at it from the perspective that God, the God of logic and reason, designed this world and designed our minds with the ability to reason and to use logic, well, then that's an ultimate justification. Now, we can debate about whether God exists, and we can talk traditional apologetics, and I can give you some evidences for that. But from a presuppositional position of apologetics, God has to exist. Because if God does not exist, there is absolutely zero justification for the laws of logic, or an objective standard of morality, or even the ability to do science. I hope that is clear and helpful. Lord willing, I'll see you next time.